Queer people have always been in country music despite every effort to push them out. Howdy, hello, how are you doing? My name is Victoria if you're new here, and if you're not new here, welcome back. I am a singer-songwriter and independent music journalist, and on this channel I make various videos on various topics within the whole world of music. History and pop culture, commentary on music and the music industry, and whatever else we can muster up over here in my little musical world. It is currently Pride Month, and as a queer country fan and artist myself, I could not be more excited to talk to you guys today about the history of queer country music. So put on your cowboy hat and let's ride all the way back to the 1970s. Right before the turn of the decade in 1969, the Stonewall riots happened in New York City. If you don't know, Stonewall was a series of demonstrations by the LGBTQ plus community that started at a popular queer-safe bar called the Stonewall Inn. The police raided the bar and quickly became violent, and the community in Greenwich Village fought back. Protests sprung up all over the city, and despite police still raiding queer spaces and inciting violence, the protests continued and sparked a queer rights movement across the country that hadn't ever been seen in the United States before. The following decade was filled with a lot of progress for the queer community. Discrimination laws were being passed, not only in the United States, but internationally as well. Queer people were being elected to political positions for the first time. And overall, the community just saw a record-breaking amount of visibility. But despite all of these strides, of course, there was no shortage of homophobia within the culture. And country music was full of it. Plot twist, it still is. There were a lot of queer musicians who were bursting onto the music scene during this time, but there were few and far between that were out and proudly making music about their queerness. You think of artists like Elton John, who is now regarded as one of the most incredible queer musicians of all time, but even he was not open about his queerness until 1976 when he announced he was bisexual, and he didn't come out as gay until 1988. But in 1972, in Seattle, Washington, a group decided to push all the buttons of mainstream country music, and it all starts with a man named Patrick Haggerty. Patrick was born in 1944 and grew up on a dairy farm in Washington. He pretty much came out as queer as he could be, and thankfully he had a super progressive father who supported him from the time he was 4 years old and beyond. He helped Patrick make costumes and encouraged him to be fully himself, which in the 50s, parents like his were extremely rare. Patrick credits his father to this day with the success of Lavender Country and says the reason he made the album is because his dad said he could. Fast forward a few years later, and Patrick joined and was subsequently kicked out of the Peace Corps for being gay. He had always been an activist in his own right, but after his Peace Corps experience, it didn't take long for him to become a much more radical activist for queer rights, the anti-war movement, and socialism. It was the passion for activism instilled by his dad that ultimately fueled Lavender Country, the first known openly gay country album in music history. Lavender has been used for decades to describe and identify queer people. Some speculating that it goes even further back to like early America when the men would have streaks of lavender on their person. I will link a really cool article that I found while researching this video that goes through all kinds of different instances throughout history where that lavender symbolism comes up. It's really cool. Highly recommend you check it out. It'll be in the description. In the 70s, it became a more widely known symbol after a lesbian and bisexual activism group called the Lavender Menace protested in New York City against the exclusion of lesbian and bisexual women in the feminist movement. The term Lavender Menace came from the president of the National Organization for Women, Betty Friedan, to describe the threat she believed queer women posed to the feminist agenda. From there on after, lavender became an even more important symbol for the queer community as a whole. So when Patrick got home, he got involved with a group called the Gay Community Social Services of Seattle. There, he joined forces with Michael Carr, Eve Morris, and Robert Hammerstrom, who was the token straight member of the group, to form Lavender Country, employing that lavender plant once again as a symbol of pride. The group worked in tandem with the local gay community in Seattle to develop most of the songs on the album. So the very first line on the album is, "Waking up to say, hip hip hooray, I'm glad I'm gay." Not wasting any time, getting right to the point. I don't believe that those words had ever been muttered in a country song before that exact moment. And while all of these songs did what needed to be done, the most popular song from the album is Crying These Cocksucking Tears. Haggerty's voice cuts through the fiddles and the church piano. The whole album is really filled with a lot of intimate details on the queer experience and the pain that queer people experienced at the hands of all of that ignorance. All of that sung over country instrumentation, country phrasing, country melodies. Everything that you can possibly imagine putting on a country album, sonically and emotionally, can be found on this album. They call out the hypocrisy, they make fun of stereotypes, and they successfully created a radical musical community protest in the absolutely least progressive genre in all of music. And I think that that is literally the coolest fucking shit ever. Now, while this album is looked back on now as a beacon in queer history, at the time, it did not have any success. There were only 1,000 copies of the record ever printed, and in 1976, Lavender Country would actually dissolve after a few years of performances across the country. The only way to break into country music back then, and even now, is through the radio. And Cocksuckin' Tears was not going to make the cut among the rugged, manly, cowboy hat, beer drinking, girl loving music that was all being pushed on country music all the time. And as time went on, Lavender Country received a lot more backlash as the queer rights movement was co-opted by the Democratic Party. You know, they wanted to support queer rights, but just a little bit. And Lavender Country was way, way, way too radical to fit within the new queer rights movement in the mainstream culture. Now, while Lavender Country did not make it far in the beginning, they definitely caused a stir, and they opened doors for queer country musicians, even if it wouldn't be recognized until decades later. So queer country music flew under the radar for another 40 years after Lavender Country was released and subsequently repressed. Through the 80s and into the beginning of the 90s, country music was absolutely stacked and filled to the brim with straight, cisgender male artists, with the occasional female country star that usually still had to go along with the boys in one way or another. And even when they did do that, they got a fraction of the playtime that their male counterparts did. Black artists, female artists, queer artists, they were all being pushed further and further and further away from the genre that was built off of their stories. If you want to see more of a country music history in general video, I will put a link here and in the description below to a video that I did last year on the Black origins of country music and how those origins have also been erased from country music history until recently. But in this video, we are focusing on queer country music specifically. So the popularity of outlaw country lasted all the way through the 80s and through the beginning of the 90s. It wasn't until Shania Twain popped up on the scene and shot to absolute superstardom that these feminist country women would be getting their time. Still less than the men, but better than before. Shania Twain, Martina McBride, The Chicks, all of these iconic female country artists wrote feminist anthems, and not only were they popular among the women country fans, but in the closet queer country fans as well, in small towns across America. The renaissance of country music that kind of happened during that late 90s was the first wave of feminism that had ever really swept through the genre and got really popular. And there's no doubt that this definitely added another layer of that foundation that would support queer country artists in the next 20 years. Once you get into the early 2000s, there is a little bit of regression. After 9/11 and during the Bush administration, country music kind of became the vessel for nationalism, and you get the rise of what's known as stadium country or bro country, which focuses on that good old country love for America, trucks, beer, sexy hot country ladies. The women were still there, but now their playtime had gotten even lower. And if they were not talking about topics that fit into that American girl ideology, they were out. Most famously, this happened to the Chicks. Their career was temporarily obliterated after they spoke out against the Bush administration and the war in the Middle East. The genre focused so heavily on the image and the idea of a perfect, picturesque, patriotic America that it became only accessible and relatable to the demographic of people that benefited from that patriotic American image. And that was now the image of country music, and queer people were not a part of that picture. Until 2014, when Lavender Country was brought back to life. After gaining some traction on the internet in the early 2010s, the group reunited with founder Patrick Haggerty, now in his 70s, and they happily and extravagantly reintroduced queer country music to an entirely new generation. The combination of internet culture and social progress from the original release time harnessed more and more buzz and really created an entirely new definition of outlaw country. It was this re-release that would develop into the fan base for artists like Orville Peck, Trixie Mattel, and Lil Nas X, who absolutely burst down the doors to country music with Old Town Road in 2018. Lavender Country has now collaborated with a bunch more artists like Trixie and Paisley Fields, and they just released their second album, Blackberry Rose, in February of 2022. Queer country music is stronger than ever before in pop culture. There is an infinite amount of possibilities of what could come out of this section of country music. And while that community grows and grows and hopefully gets stronger and stronger, queer country music is still not widely accepted in the mainstream country music industrial complex. All of the popular queer artists within the genre have had to work 100 times harder than their straight counterparts to get to where they are now. They aren't just working to shoot themselves into stardom. They are actively creating a safe space for queer people within a historically homophobic genre. They are giving space to the queer kids who grew up in hometowns like mine that were forced in the closet and had no representation in the genre that surrounded them. There is a lot of resentment towards country music and queer culture today as well, and rightfully so. Many of its most popular artists have directly spoken out against the rights of queer people, which is why it's so important to know and spread the message that those artists are not making real country music. It sounds like country music, but it ain't. They are just ambassadors for these huge corporate companies that directly benefit from a lot of the willful ignorance within mainstream country audiences today. Those artists empower the most hateful parts of American culture under the guise of manhood, patriotism, just good old country fun. They sing songs that they didn't even write about hard work and being a good man from a multi-million-dollar home that they come home to after cheating on their wife. That side of country music is bullshit. It's the queer side of country music. It's the black side of country music. It's the feminist side of country music. The socialist, progressive side of country music. That is where the most communal and beautiful artistry in all of country music resides. More than anything else in this video, I want to extend a personal invitation over to this side of country music. It can be such a safe haven for so many emotions and experiences that are tailored to every individual artist. There are so many more artists in this genre besides Lavender Country, Trixie Mattel, Orville Peck. You have artists like Joy Olatakun, Fancy Haygood, so many more, and I want more. I want more people to feel like they can jump into this genre just like anybody else can. Queer country history only goes back so far, but there are years and years ahead of us to fill with boundary-breaking, genre-bending, revolutionary queer artistry. And I hope this video inspired you even just a little bit to check some of that out. If you need a good place to start on finding some of that music, feel free to check out my first Rodeo playlist, which will be linked in the description below. It is a playlist highlighting Black, Indigenous, and queer country music. I'm always looking to add to it. Always let me know if you have any suggestions for any of my playlists. And of course, if you enjoyed our little rendezvous today, feel free to like the video and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss the next one. If you're really into me, you can also hit the notification so you definitely don't miss the next one. All my socials are linked below, including the Patreon and all the blog stuff. And I think that about wraps it all up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.